Happy e-learning day 3, friends. It's time to talk To Kill a Mockingbird. Today, all about chapters 13 and 14 and what happens in those. We're going to skim them as quickly as we can. So I need you to have your book ready. To open your book for me, please. And I need you to turn to page... Chapter 12 was all about the church scene. I hope you enjoyed that chapter. I think it's so interesting, the conflict between Lula and Calpurnia and how the children feel at church and how it's so different from what they know. And they get this new sense of Calpurnia's identity that they never had before. This part of the community that's just kind of opened up to them in an interesting way. But then on the bottom of 167, top of 168, they're all excited and giddy, and they look down the street, and I see enamored, upright, and uncompromising Aunt Alexandra was sitting in a rocking chair, exactly as if she had sat there every day of her life. And I wrote, dun, 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 insert suspenseful music, because I feel like clearly that's Harper Lee establishing keyword for this lesson, conflict. Remember, we talked about internal conflict, external conflict. We've talked about all kinds of conflict this semester. And this whole sort of skim is all about identifying and understanding conflict. So Calpurnia immediately in 13 grabs Alexandra's bag. And Aunt Alexandra in 13 says that it was time for you to have some feminine influence, Jean Louise, at the top of 170. It won't be many years before you become interested in clothes and boys. And then she says, Scout says, well, what about your husband? Is he coming too? Nope, he's going to stay away. So maybe Aunt Alexandra wanted a little bit of this vacation. And then on 170, this is an important descriptor right here of the relationship that she has with her aunt. I could think of nothing else to say to her. In fact, I could never think of anything to say to her. And I sat thinking of past painful conversations between us. How are you, Jean Louise? Fine, thank you, ma'am. How are you? Very well, thank you. There was just nothing for them to really talk about, right? So then she stays and stays and stays, and that she needed some influence. There's this really important quote on 171 I want you to mark right here. Can you guys see it? Where my finger is? She's talking to Atticus, and she's like, Atticus, I don't really understand why Auntie has to be here. And Atticus says, your aunt's doing me a favor as well as you all. I can't stay here all day with you, and this summer's going to be a hot one. And I want you to think about hot meaning, having multiple meaning. It's more than just hot temperature. It's hot because the trial's going to happen in the summer, and it's hot because of the Tom Robinson case and all the drama that it has stirred up. And so it's not just a literal hot, it's a metaphorical hot, which again creates conflict. Okay, so blah 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 blah. So on 172, she just talks about like the families of Macomb County, so you can read that if you want to. But on 173, I'm going to read this part to you, where my finger is right now. I never understood her preoccupation with heredity. Somewhere I'd received the impression that fine folks were people who did the best they could with the sense they had. But Aunt Alexandra was of the opinion, obliquely expressed, that the longer a family had been squatting on one patch of land, the finer the family was. Well, that makes the Yules fine folks then, said Jim. The tribe of which Burris Yule and his brethren consisted had lived on the same plot of earth behind the Macomb dump and had thrived on county welfare for generations. But then on 173, Aunt Alexandra goes on to explain what makes a family fine. And there's this really interesting discussion about the caste system in Macomb, which happens on 175 over here where my blue is, okay? Sorry, I know the lighting's a little rough, guys. My apologies. Okay. There was indeed a caste system in Macomb, but to my mind it worked this way. The older citizens, the present generation of people who'd lived side by side for years and years, were utterly predictable to one another. They took for granted attitudes, character shadings, even gestures as having been repeated in each generation and refined by time. Thus the dicta, no Crawford minds his own business. Every third Meriwether is morbid. The truth is not in the Delafields. All the Bufords walk like that. We're simply guides to daily living. Never take a check from a Delafield without a discreet call to the bank. And Miss Monty Atkinson's shoulder stoops because she was a Buford. And Miss Grace Merriweather sips on gin out of Lydia E. Pinkman's bottles. It's nothing unusual. Her mama did the same. So it's that kind of small town mentality, right? Where everybody knows everybody and everybody's put in a little stereotypical box that they can't get out of, remember? Which creates conflict. Okay, so and it's kind of hard because the kids don't really understand it. Like Scout doesn't really understand it. Jim doesn't really understand it. Nobody really, the kids can't, they don't really get it, right? People are people to them. So turn the page. Talks about the cousin Lily. There's a skeleton in the Finch closet about a cousin who has like a shady past. And then basically Atticus says to the kids, I need you to mind your aunt. I need you to be kind to her. I need you to take, to do what she says. And then he says this thing in the bottom of 177 like that. Oops, sorry, my bad. Right there. You guys see it? He says, gentle breeding, she continued when I had found and scratched it, and that you should try to live up to your name. Atticus persevered in spite of us. She asked me to tell you that you must try to behave like the little lady and gentleman that you are. She wants to talk to you about the family and what it's meant to Macomb County throughout the years. So you'll have some idea who you are. So you might be moved to behave accordingly. And Atticus is kind of going on, and Scout just starts bawling because she's confused and she's crying and she doesn't understand and she doesn't like Aunt Alexandra and she doesn't want her in her house. And it creates conflict. Okay, so all of these things happen, and then finally Atticus just says, forget it. All the things I said are dumb. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. Just forget it. Okay. And I think that that's really important to remember. Atticus just kind of gives in because he remembers that they're just kids. Okay, now, let me see if you can see this. Again, the light's a little grainy. But here are the big things I want you to take away from this chapter, okay? Aunt Alexandra comes to town. That's a big thing. Auntie fits right into town life with the ladies. That's another big thing. The caste system in Macomb and its history. And then it's about understanding family history. Again, you're welcome to read chapter 13 if you want to. It's a lot of pages, but this is kind of the basis of what it covers. Guys, what I would do if I were you right now is I would pause so that you can write these notes down at the end of your chapter for your summary, okay? I'm going to keep going just so this video is not 27 minutes long. All right? So pause right now if you need to, and then just hit play again when you need to. Okay, now. All of that is chapter 13. Turn the page. Chapter 14 is a chapter of a lot of action. But again, not necessarily a chapter you have to read. We can just kind of skim through it, okay? Blah, 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 blah. On the way home from church that day, Scout asked Calpurnia what rape was. And Calpurnia's like, I'm not going to answer that. You can ask your dad. So she does. And she does it on page 14. What's rape? I asked him that night. And I wrote, tough question, right? Talk about a hard thing to answer to a kid. Atticus looked around from behind his paper, and he was in his chair by the window. As we grew older, Jim and I thought it generous to allow Atticus 30 minutes to himself after supper. That is very generous. Maybe you should do that with your parents during this e-learning window. Give them a little time away from you. He sighed and said rape was carnal knowledge of a female by force and without consent. Very lawyer definition. And that's the kind of definition that a dad would give a kid, right? Well, if that's all that it is, why did Calpurnia dry me up when I asked her what it was? And Atticus looked pensive. So I'm going to read most of 181 to you, so just kind of follow along as I go. What's that again? Atticus said. Well, I asked Calpurnia coming from church that day what it was, and she said, ask you, but I forgot, and now I'm asking you. And his paper was now in his lap. Again, please? He said, and I told him in detail about our trip to church with Calpurnia, and Atticus seemed to enjoy it, but Aunt Alexandra, who was sitting in the corner quietly sewing, put down her embroidery and stared at us. And you can imagine she was staring intently. Y'all were coming back from Calpurnia's church that Sunday? Jim said, yes'm, she took us. And I remembered something. Yes, ma'am. And she promised me I could come out to her house some afternoon. I guess I'll go next Sunday if that's all right with you, can I? And Cal said she'd come and get me if you were off in the car. And suddenly we hear someone say, "You may not." Aunt Alexandra said it, and I wheeled around, startled, and then turned back to Atticus in time to catch a swift glance at her, but it was too late, and I said, "I didn't ask you." Sassy. And for a big man, Atticus could get up and down in a chair faster than anyone I ever knew, and he was on his feet. "Apologize to your aunt," he said. "I didn't ask her. I asked you." Atticus turned his head and pinned me to the wall with his good eye, and his voice was deadly. "First, apologize to your aunt." "I'm sorry, Auntie," I muttered. "Now then, let's get this clear. Calpurnia tells you, you do as I tell you, and as long as your aunt's in this house, you will do as she tells you. Understand?" And I understood. And then she was kind of like upset, right? Again. Okay, so you guys get it, right? Now, Auntie and Atticus start talking because remember they're brother and sister, right? And so Alexander basically says, "You don't need Calpurnia anymore because I'm here." And Atticus says, "No, we're going to keep her because we need her." And that's the bottom of 182. And then 183, he says, "I think we need her as much as we ever did, and that she's been a wonderful nanny to them, just as good, if not hard on them, than any mom might be." And so it created an interesting conversation. And then Jim and Scout talk because Jim says that Auntie's been fussing. And then Jim gets all like haughty, right? Because chapter 12, suddenly Jim knows everything because he's, 12 and he's moody and cantankerous and grumpy and blah, blah, blah. And I'm supposed to leave him alone. And he's kind of a bossy pants, right? So Jim says, on the bottom of 183, Scout says, "You trying to tell me what to do?" He says, "No. Dad's got a lot on his mind right now," without us worrying him. Atticus. "Like what?" "This Tom Robinson case is worrying him to death," says Jim. And maybe this is a little bit of the difference in age between Jim and Scout, because Scout wouldn't even really notice because she's so little, but Jim does notice that, in fact, it's actually bothering him. Okay? Okay, so then on 184, Jim says this: "That's because you can't hold something in your mind but a little while. It's different with grown folks. We..." And Scout says, "His maddening superiority." Ooh, I want you to mark this where my finger is. Okay. Can you see it? Again, I'm sorry that the light's really fuzzy today, guys. "His maddening superiority was unbearable these days. He didn't want to do anything but read and go off by himself, and still, everything he read he passed along to me, but with this difference. Formerly, because he thought I'd like it. Now, for my edification and instruction. Gee, crawling Hova, Jim, who do you think you are?" "Now, I mean it, Scout. You antagonize Auntie and I'll spank you." And with that, I was gone. "You damn Morphodite, I'll kill you!" And he was sitting on the bed, and it was easy to grab his front hair and land a punch on his mouth. Blah, 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 blah. They fight. And she says, "Because he's fighting me back, I knew we were still equals." "Ain't so high and mighty now, are ya?" I screamed. So Scout's trying to prove a point. So a little bit of conflict because Jim is a little bit old for his britches, right? And Scout's getting a little frustrated with him. But he is a little bit older, and he understands some things that maybe she doesn't, okay? Now, all of that said, they go to bed, and Scout says on 186, "Jim," they're laying down in bed, and she feels something and feels like maybe it's a snake. In kind of the middle of the page, "Do snakes grunt?" "It ain't a snake," Jim said. "It's somebody." And suddenly a filthy brown package shot from under the bed, and Jim raised the broom and missed Dill's head by an inch when it appeared. "God almighty!" Jim's voice was reverent, and we watched Dill emerge by degrees. It was a tight fit, and he stood up and eased his shoulders and turned his feet and rubbed the back of his neck, and his circulation restored, he said, "Hey, So Dill was not supposed to come to them this summer because he had a new stepdaddy. And the new stepdaddy he thought was going to take care and want to spend time with him and do all these things with him and da. And as you read, it turns out that that's not, in fact, what he wanted to do. They would send Dill with money to the movies and just expect Dill to go be occupied. They would buy Dill a new toy and just expect Dill to go be occupied. So he felt, honestly, rather ignored. And so he just decided he was going to, take his money, buy a ticket, and go to Macomb where people loved him. But man, it sure did create a little bit of a fluster. So they end up getting a hold of his mom and his parents, but he stays with Aunt Rachel. And then on 189, there's this really interesting thing, okay? So I'm going to have you write, this is really important, so I kind of want you to be able to see it. Can you see it? From rape, Atticus says, from rape to riot to runaways, I wonder what the next 2 hours will bring. And I wrote the word foreshadowing. Okay? So there's been a lot of, again, conflict, but we're going to foreshadow even more conflict that's coming in the next chapter. Okay? So I'm going to, there are a couple more things that I want you to mark in this chapter, 190, 191. Okay, so there's something that really important. Dill was talking about how he was so lonely and he felt like nobody wanted him around. And on 192, so we're at the very end of the chapter on 192. And really down here is what I want you to pay attention to, okay? Okay. Dill, as they're starting to go to sleep. Why do you reckon B. Radley's never run off? Really important question, huh? Because you'd think if he were unhappy, he'd just go away. Dill sighed a long sigh and turned away from me. Maybe he didn't have anywhere to run off to. Kind of a sad thought to think about, right? But when Dill felt like he was being ignored, embarrassed, etc., he could come to the Finches because they were a safe haven for him. But how many people don't have a safe haven like that? And especially Boo Radley. Where's he going to go, right? This is the only place he's ever known. It's the only family he's ever had. So he doesn't have any kind of safe haven that he can run to. And what a sad state to be in, right? Which creates, again, conflict. Okay, hopefully you feel like you kind of understood all the conflict that's presented in the chapter. Chapters 13 and 14, again, you are welcome to read and annotate all that you want. It's just that those chapters take up a lot of pages, and we're kind of trying to get you more to the heart of the novel in part 2, which is as the trial begins and that kind of conflict begins, okay? So this is the post-it for chapter 14. Let me put it really close for you so you can see it. So chapter 14, on page 189, there's foreshadowing. Scout asks what rape is, and Atticus defines it. On Alexander wants to retire Calpurnia, and Atticus says, no way. Jim threatens to spank Scout. And then the snake Dill ran away because he was feeling neglected, okay? So again, I'm going to put that there for you, and you just pause if you need to, but I'm going to try to finish up this video so that it is under your 20 minutes, okay? All right, so again, essential skill from these 2 chapters, conflict, okay? So on Alexandria creates conflict. The difference in opinions that she and Atticus have creates conflict. The way that she sees Calpurnia creates conflict. The way that Dill's parents interact with him creates conflict. The way that the town sees Atticus creates conflict. I mean, they're just all of these layers upon layers of things that are building. So right now what Harper Lee's doing is she's ramping up our rising action, right? And our plot structure. She's building the suspense and building the suspense for all of the things that are to come, okay? So your next step is going to be 15, and you're going to have a couple days to read 15 because it's a long chapter. So you're going to read it, and then we're going to do some things with it, and we're going to watch some video clips and things. So I would say make sure you look at the reading calendar because I don't think I wanted you to read all of it. So look at the reading calendar and check the pages and only read the pages that you need for tomorrow or for Thursday's lesson. And then I'll check back with you and we'll have your e-learning posted, okay? All right, thanks guys. Bye.